Welcome to Libeth. Tonight, we enter the world of Heian, Japan, a world of candle-lit rooms, layered silk robes, political marriages, hidden rivalries, poetic exchanges, and private emotions preserved in writing for 1,000 years. But these diaries are not simply historical curiosities. They are among the earliest sustained attempts in world literature to describe what it feels like to possess an inner life that cannot fully exist within the society surrounding it. Tonight, we begin with the women themselves. Murasaki Shikibu, Izumi Shikibu, and the author of the Sarashina Diary. 3 writers who transformed memory, longing, isolation, desire, and disappointment into literature that still feels psychologically modern today. Let's start with a fact that is easy to say and hard to fully absorb. 3 of the most psychologically sophisticated personal documents in all of world literature were written by women in Japan, within about 60 years of each other, during a period when the dominant literary language of official record was one they were largely excluded from using. They wrote instead in their own vernacular, in a form that was considered informal, domestic, feminine, and they produced texts that the rest of the world's literary traditions are still catching up to. The 3 diaries are the Diary of Murasaki Shikibu, written around 1008 to 1010, the Diary of Izumi Shikibu, written around 1003, and what we call the Sarashina Diary, written in the 1060s by a woman known to us only by her diary's title. They are not equally famous. Murasaki Shikibu is the most celebrated because she also wrote the Tale of Genji, and the reputation of that text has cast everything associated with her in its light. Izumi Shikibu is well known among scholars of the period, celebrated as a poet, considered slightly scandalous. The author of the Sarashina Diary is the least famous of the 3, which is genuinely unfair, because her diary contains something that the other 2 don't quite have. A complete life, rendered from beginning to end, shaped by the retrospective intelligence of someone who has had time to understand what happened to her. The reason to read all 3 together is not simply that they are contemporaneous, though they are. It is that they triangulate something that none of them could accomplish alone. They are 3 different women, in 3 different positions within the same social world, responding to the same fundamental problem from 3 different angles, through 3 completely different literary forms. Together, they produce something like a complete portrait of what it meant to be an intelligent woman in Heian, Japan. Separately, each is extraordinary. Together, they become something that feels almost systematic, as if the period produced, without intending to, a comprehensive account of itself through the eyes of women it never quite knew what to do with. Start with Murasaki Shikibu. She was a lady-in-waiting to Empress Shoshi, one of the 2 competing empresses at the Heian court, and she was employed in that role partly because she was already celebrated as the author of the Tale of Genji, a text so far ahead of its time that we still argue about the right way to describe it. It is the world's first novel, by most reasonable definitions. It is a psychological portrait of a man whose beauty and refinement and emotional intelligence exceed anything the real world could produce, written by a woman whose own intelligence exceeded what her world could accommodate. The connection between those 2 facts is not incidental. Her diary, written during her period of service to Empress Shoshi, is not Genji. It is shorter, fragmentary, discontinuous, less a sustained narrative than a series of dispatches from someone who is simultaneously embedded in a world and unable to be fully of it. It contains detailed accounts of the great ceremonies of Shoshi's court, the rituals surrounding the Empress's pregnancy, the processions, the festivals, the precisely calibrated exchanges of poetry that constituted social and political currency. And it contains, interspersed among these ceremonial accounts, a portrait of the woman doing the describing, and that portrait is of someone who found almost all of it unbearable. She writes about hiding her Chinese literacy. She writes about retreating to her room and crying while the social world around her conducted its entertainments. She writes about feeling fraudulent, unfit for court life, certain that the other women disliked her. She writes character sketches of those other women that are so precise and so clear that they tell you immediately she was the most perceptive person in any room she entered, and that this perception was, for her, not a source of pleasure but of a particular and very specific isolation. The novelist at her own life, observing everything belonging to nothing. The hook, if you want one. She wrote the Tale of Genji, which is one of the most celebrated works in all of world literature. She was also, by her own account, convinced that everyone at the court where she lived and worked hated her. Both of these things are true. They are not contradictory. They are the same thing, expressed in different registers. Then there is Izumi Shikibu, whose diary covers a different kind of experience entirely. If Murasaki is the observer, the woman who processed the world through intelligence and distance, Izumi is the opposite of that. She was, by any account, one of the great poets of the Heian period. She was also divorced, socially exposed, and involved in a relationship with an imperial prince that the court treated as a scandal, and she treated as the most important thing in her life. Her diary records the affair with Prince Atsumichi, which began after the death of his brother, Prince Tamataka, whom Izumi had also loved, and it records it without apology, without the aestheticized distance that Heian literary convention provided for exactly this kind of situation, without performing the managed femininity that the social world required. The hook for Izumi. In a world where female desire was supposed to be invisible, or at least managed into acceptable forms, she published hers. The diary is an account of wanting, grieving, opening, risking, and continuing to want, written in a period when all of that was supposed to be subordinated to the social script, and written by someone who was entirely aware of that expectation and refused it anyway. Other women of the period wrote about longing. Izumi wrote about desire. The distinction is the entire argument. And then there is the author of the Sarashina Diary, known to us by the title of her text, and not by any name we have confidence in. She was the daughter of a provincial governor, raised partly in the provinces, and she came to the Heian capital, Kyoto, as a girl with her imagination already saturated by the Tale of Genji. She had heard about it before she could read it. When she finally got access to the complete text, she describes reading it with an intensity that sounds almost religious, days of continuous reading, the real world receding entirely while the fictional world of Genji surrounded her. And then she grew up. She served briefly and marginally at court. She married, somewhat reluctantly and late. Her husband died. She raised children who barely appear in the diary. She grew old and Buddhist and full of regret. The diary she eventually wrote covers roughly 40 years, more than either of the other two. And it is written retrospectively, looking back from old age over a life that had not gone the way she expected. The hook for the Sarashina Diary. She was the first person in literary history to describe, in sustained and honest detail, what it does to you to love fiction more than you love reality. And the answer she arrived at, over the course of a long life, was complicated. Because the fiction had given her the tools to write the diary, which meant that even her regret about it was beautiful, which meant that the regret was also, somehow, the point. These three women did not know each other, exactly, though they overlapped. Murasaki Shikibu knew of Izumi Shikibu. She writes about her in the diary, in a passage that tells you almost as much about Murasaki as about Izumi. The author of the Sarashina Diary was probably born around the time Murasaki was writing her diary. She didn't know Murasaki, but she had read everything Murasaki produced, and the way she writes about Genji tells you that Murasaki's imagination had colonized hers before she had a chance to develop an alternative. The three texts are in conversation with each other, whether the authors intended it or not. The form they all wrote in, the kana nikki, the diary in the Japanese vernacular syllabary, was not incidental. Classical Chinese was the prestige language of official record, of government, of formal literary production. Men wrote in Chinese. Women wrote in kana. This was a form of exclusion, obviously, a way of keeping women out of the official literary record. But it was also, and this is the crucial thing, a form of freedom. The diary in kana was not monitored the way official documents were. It was not required to perform the official version of events. It was not accountable to the political requirements of the Regency or the court. It was, in short, the one form in which a woman could say what was actually true about herself, about her world, about the gap between the performance the system required and the reality the performance concealed. All three of these women understood this. And what each of them chose to say in that space, what each of them selected as the truth worth recording, is what makes these texts so different from each other and so necessary read together. Murasaki chose to document the gap between the ceremonial surface of the court and the private reality of living inside it. Her diary is a study in double vision. The ceremonies described in extraordinary detail, the private reality of someone who felt almost nothing at them described with the same care. She is doing two things simultaneously, recording the world and diagnosing it, and the diagnosis is in the description. Izumi chose to document desire as a primary fact of existence, not as a secondary quality to be managed and aestheticized. Her diary is a record of the inner life insisted upon, of feeling presented not as decoration, but as substance, not as something to be arranged within conventions, but as something that precedes and exceeds convention. Sarashina chose to document a whole life, the arc of it, the shape, what childhood was like and what adulthood did to it. She is the only one of the three who gives us old age, which is itself significant. The other two catch their subjects in media res, in the middle of court service, in the middle of a relationship. Sarashina shows us what happens after. She shows us a person who has survived long enough to look back and see the pattern, and who has the literary intelligence to render that pattern honestly, including the parts that are unflattering to herself. The comparison among all three is what makes each one richer. Murasaki without Izumi is an observer without a subject to illuminate by contrast. Izumi without Murasaki loses the external witness who confirms the social reality she was navigating. Both without Sarashina lack the long view, the perspective from a life that has been fully lived and retrospectively understood. And Sarashina without the other two is missing the living present that her retrospective memoir transcends. There is one more thing to say in this introduction. And it is the most important. These diaries are not interesting primarily as historical documents, though they are historically invaluable. They are interesting because they are psychologically true in ways that do not require historical context to feel. Murasaki's experience of being the most perceptive person in a room that was not designed for her perception is not limited to Heian Japan. Izumi's insistence on the primacy of the inner life against the social demand to manage, it is not a medieval phenomenon. Sarashina's discovery that fiction had built expectations that life could not match is perhaps the most modern experience of all. We have an entire cultural apparatus for producing exactly that condition now, and she was writing about it in the 1060s. The millennium between us and them is real. The geography is different. The social structures are different. The specific forms of constraint are different. But the underlying experience of intelligence navigating systems that cannot accommodate it, of the private self surviving the performance of the public one, of the gap between the life you expected and the life you got, this is not historical. It is present. It is why we are still reading these texts, and why reading them together is different from reading any one of them alone. And perhaps that is the first thing these diaries teach us, that even across a millennium, the private self remains recognizable. The court vanished. The ceremonies disappeared. The political system collapsed. But the experiences these women recorded, alienation, desire, ambition, regret, disappointment, the search for meaning inside systems that cannot fully understand us, survived their world completely. Reading these 3 diaries together is not simply a way of learning about Heian Japan. It is a way of watching 3 different consciousnesses struggle to make sense of existence itself. That's all for tonight on Libeth. 1 new book every week. At least we try.